and I would like to talk about some indicators of change, and then ask the question, and it is as much my question that I had to figure out for myself. Is there reason to hope? Is it realistic to hope? What does it mean to hope? So the context within which I would like us to think about this topic is where we are with this terrible genocide in Gaza. But it's not only in Gaza, it's in all of Palestine. And it's also obliterating all the Palestinians who are not allowed to return. You know, most of us think that ceasefire means ceasefire, right? But for the Palestinians, in their practical day-to-day experience, from the beginning of the first ceasefire, because there's been many, up to where we are now, a ceasefire, to them, the reality that plays out is that they say, we as Palestinians seize, and you as Israelis, you fire. Because that's what happened. Israel never stopped. About 600 people have been killed since ceasefire started. Almost 2,000 have been injured. So a ceasefire is just a kind of camouflage for continuing ethnic cleansing. Most of these people who were killed were women and children, ambulances, doctors, pharmacists, and so on. And on top of that, there are thousands of Palestinians without charges in prisons, or who were abducted, or who died in prison. It is part of a design strategy, an established practice by an army that is known as the most moral army in the world. The personal account, witness of a retired US Army Lieutenant Colonel. He's still a young guy. He served in the US Army, but also in Special Forces, or he was a Green Beret, and his witness account, and why he resigned, and his journey with his commanders to say, but what is happening here? Because he witnessed how people were killed, people who came for food, children who came for food, children who received food, thanked them, turned around with the food and was killed, and how that was celebrated. But it's hair-raising to listen to him, and he became a whistleblower. The arguments that Israel have about self-defense and precision, you know, that collapse under the weight of the evidence on the ground. But even now, under the ceasefire, the airstrikes, the shelling, the gunfire, I have a piece from a UN report here, and I'm reading from it, continue across Gaza, causing casualties and exposing the civilians, including workers and medical teams, to deadly risks. Shelter conditions remain dire, unsafe locations, children remain exposed to explosive ordnance, there are health risks, the water quality remains unsafe, people get diarrhea and hepatitis A, and then there's the winter weather and the transit delays, significant spoilage of food and other commodities, all by design, all by design. So Francesca Albanese, who was actually here in our country, she spoke at the Grote Kerk in Cape Town in October last year. She said, if peace has already started and Gaza is no longer a combat zone, it means that international journalists come in, and that the global Summit flotilla can resume its humanitarian convoys, right? Of course not. Or is Israel still afraid of international observers? So international observers may still not enter Gaza, and obviously the journalists, the Palestinian journalists who work for Agence France Presse or Al Jazeera or whoever, they are part of the people who are targeted. So Israel's agenda has always been to take as much of the land as possible, and this is a summary of it, but it actually started early. It started in the beginning of the 19th century, when Zionism, Jewish Zionism, started as, note this, a secular movement in Europe. And they considered land in Uganda and Argentina, and settled on Palestine because apparently it was a land without a people, for a people, without a land. But at the time, Theodor Herzl basically had, it was a secular movement and he wanted to reign. That was his agenda. But this is the situation, all of it was green. So in the Bible, with which I grew up, the word Palestine, and on the maps the word Palestine appeared. That has been filtered out, all under Zionist influence in the World Council of Churches many years ago. And we have been brainwashed, but anyway, all was green. So, but all these Jewish people from Europe, because they were under threat in Europe, because that's when the Jewish persecution in Europe started, they moved to Palestine, they bought land and they settled. But gradually, because there was already organized propaganda or Hasbara, and the bottom line of this Hasbara was, we know better. We want to organize this place. We want to rule. If you do as we tell you to do, there will be no harm. But if you resist us, face it. So, violence erupted. And what they did to calm the two groups of people was to say, okay, here's the solution. Let's give most of the land to the European Jews who come in, to the Jewish population. At the time, before the Jews from Europe moved in, only 7%, a very, very small percentage of the population consisted of Jews. The rest were Arab people, were indigenous people, right? Were Palestinians. But let's give 55, and then 45 goes to the Palestinians. So that didn't go down well, and the Arab countries became involved. I don't want to call it a war because it sounds like something like between two equal parties. It's not a conflict, it's oppression. It's not a war, it's a wholesale takeover. So after the wholesale takeover initiative of the past few years, 60% is Palestinians may not enter that 60%. But in the West Bank, things are worse. Many people don't know that because it's not televised. But there's financial warfare. Something that I learned now when I read up is that a few years ago, I didn't know that, is that for nearly 3 decades, Israel has informally capped the annual conversion of shekels from Palestinian banks at 18 billion shekels. So shekels is the Israeli currency, but Palestinians are forced to use that. So the result is that Palestinian banks over these 3 decades have accumulated large surpluses of Israeli shekels, but they're unable to convert it into foreign currencies, such as the Jordanian dinar or US dollars or anything else. So it just sits there. And also this 18 billion was not in touch with the growth in the Palestinian economy. And then in May 2024, about 2 years ago, the Palestinian Monetary Authority halted banks from accepting additional shekels. They said we can do nothing with it, we don't want it. And that led to widespread disruptions because suddenly many individuals have struggled to deposit checks, money that belongs to them but they can't get it. Businesses have been unable to deposit revenues, and some residents have been pushed into overdraft. So this and the destruction of water sources, the demolition of houses, the harassment of children, the settler violence in the West Bank, the uprooting of olive trees, this economic impact, and also the legalization of the annexation, because Israel just announces the annexation and the settlements, etc., are now legal. Never mind what international law or the world says. All of that are ways to minimize and suffocate Palestinian life. One can call it slow violence, but it's slow violence over many decades. And then there's obviously the world, you know, the United States have always held the key in the United Nations on decisions on Palestine. So there have been so many resolutions against Israel by the world, that even Europe voted for. But the only body of the United Nations that can enforce decisions is the Security Council. There are 5 countries that have veto rights: Russia, China, France, Britain, and the States. So, and if any of those 5 veto a resolution, it comes to nothing. And that's what's been happening with all resolutions on Palestine. There was one where the United States abstained. We have no reason to have optimism. I can't think of a reason to have optimism in this context. Hope, on the other hand, hope demands plans. It is I can do this, and I can do this because, for instance, I learned this and that from history. And it has to do with agency, the sense that I will persevere. I will not give up. There's no reason for optimism. Nevertheless, I'm not going to do nothing. I'm going to see where I can learn. It's my pathway. And then I will have a strategy, and I will act, and I understand that things will be difficult on the way, and I will nevertheless continue. So it sits deeper than a vague sense of, yeah, things will work out for the better in the end. It's rather a psycho-spiritual strength of, okay, let's have a far bigger picture, let's look at the world history, what are the patterns, and understanding that the world goes through cycles, life goes through cycles, each of our lives go through cycles, and that things cannot stay as they are, and what can bring about that change, and the acknowledgement that I can be part of that change. So you said that I will apply it to our experience here. I think that many, my colleagues in the Kairos movement, who most of them have been part of the struggle, tell me that there was a time, a long time, when they thought things will not get better. It will never get better. And then in the 80s, as we know, and in 85, when we have the state of emergency, things were horrific in this country. Young people died. They were also shot. There was propaganda. There was illegal detentions. It was a horrific state that our country was in, a very, very dark time in our history. But that is, historians tell us, what happens is that often before things get better, it gets very dark. It gets very terrible. We can see that also from the world wars. So I personally draw a lot from the historian Ilan Pape. He identifies a few indicators of change, and I added my own here. And he says that none of these on their own may be enough to bring about change. But what we see for the first time, I've been only involved in this issue from 2011, so it's not that long. But people who've been part of it for far, far longer say that it is for the first time, and obviously from what I know from the history of this course, for the first time, things are aligning themselves. There's a trajectory, a trend that say that we are at the beginning of the end. So it's now almost 80 years after the inception of the founding of Israel. And it stands at a crossroads. So many of the people with whom I've conducted interviews, both South Africans and the Jewish Israelis whose interviews are in this book, almost all of them talk about the self-destructive behavior of the Israeli society, the Jewish Israeli society. But how the whole system is actually designed to collapse, it cannot continue, and that is what we are seeing playing out now. This retired Israeli Major General Itzhak Brick, you can go and read what he said on Ma'arif. Ma'arif is one of the most prominent newspapers in Israel. He said that the centenary of the Israeli state in 2048, when it will be 100 years old, will mark not only a date but a verdict. He is not sure that Israel will still exist in 2048. Ehud Barak, one of the former prime ministers, said the same thing, and so did many other people. So these are prominent people in the Israeli society. Before them there were many others who have been acknowledged before the genocides, the obvious part of the genocide started to saying, yes, we can no longer deny it, we are an apartheid country. The first indicator is that the mask or the veneer is being pulled away. There's so much evidence. And people are not fools, the public, civil society, across the globe. More and more people see who is the oppressor and who is the victim. It's undeniable. The opinions, and this is based on opinion polls in the past 2 years, beginning of last year already, that there's a major shift amongst voters in the United States away from support for Israel. The United States have the entire country, Democrat, Republican, whatever, they were in support of Israel. That is changing dramatically, and it's mostly the older Republicans. They don't know what to do with the overwhelming evidence. They can no longer get away with their mantras that things are too complex or that one should never take sides, that one should be balanced. So, and people start to understand that it's because also of social media. Lots of Jews in the world and also Jewish Israelis say, I'm not like that. I'm not a Zionist. And people start to see that some Jews are Zionists, the majority still are, but others are not. And it's especially younger Jews who say no. And the thing is, once someone's eyes opened, you can't go back. Once you see it, you see more of it. And this is the trend that is happening worldwide. What is also becoming visible is the complicity of Western powers, especially Europe and the United States, and they are the two Western powers that were instrumental in the establishing of the Zionist state in 1948, because they felt guilty about the Holocaust, and they sought a solution for their problem outside of their own territories. It was a cave with them that the Palestinians paid the price for the Holocaust. So, but sometimes hope comes from a deeply cynical place. In 2023, I analyzed Biden's speeches. I wrote an article about that, and he is a self, he says it. He also said it in one of those books. I am a Zionist. So, and I published it, and then it was on LitNet, which is LitNet Academies, which is an online Afrikaans platform. They asked me, well, would it have been different if Kamala Harris became president after Biden? Because obviously Trump made it worse, and so they said I must reflect on that. So I analysed his speeches. So we all know Trump strips the pretense, right? The reasonable language that Biden and Obama and Bush and Kamala, if she would have been elected, everyone before them, the reasonable approach was blah, 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 human rights, Israel is right, human rights, international law, Israel is right. So they sounded good to the public. but they actually gave preference to Israel all the time. But Trump is interested in none of that. He doesn't care if the US is seen as a reliable partner and negotiator. He doesn't care about those inventions. And he totally abandoned the empty mantras of reason and peace. But he hasn't changed the essence of the United States' position on the issue, namely that only Israel and not Palestine counts. There's no discussion on Palestinian authority. And they still send money and weapons to Israel. But there are unintended consequences. So what's the difference? Trump, with his crude language and style, he accelerates the atrocities and he takes them to the extreme. That helps to open eyes. Okay? For people to see, oh, this is what America's been doing all along. Okay? So our eyes open. His cruel and really offensive assault shatters the illusion that America will uphold international law and act against Israel. They always spoke that language, but they never did anything, as we know from the Security Council. And what is also now becoming clear is that America has absolutely no plan to end Israel's occupation of Palestine. So all this talk, all these years, about a so-called two-state solution was just a way to pacify the masses. No one has ever been serious about it, and one cannot be because it's impossible. I mean, where will this country be? During our struggle too, there were people who were co-opted. And even those who were seemingly intimately part of the struggle plotted and planned and got means and ways to silence people after the struggle so that they can get in power. And what happened here, that's also what my colleagues who were in the struggle tell me, is they thought the struggle was about ending apartheid. They now realize, no, that's not when the injustice stopped. That's not when the abuse stopped. What is uitbuiting? Exploitation stopped. That's not when the neglect of the poor stopped. Because we now sit with politicians who are there for themselves. Really, who are there mostly for themselves. And very few of them care. And we see the corruption in our country. So the struggle continues, and that tells us something about our civil responsibility. This is what I learned from them, is that our struggle also continues. But back to that context. So Trump, in a way, with his crudeness, strips the mask off, and we are able to see more clearly. The Europeans are in an interesting dilemma, and now suddenly, and they're supplying weapons to Israel, okay? And now suddenly they say, oh, but Trump can't take Greenland, that's against international law, we have to uphold international law. Okay, but so how does that now work? You uphold international law here, but not there. Okay, so all of that helps for us to see how we are being misled by our politicians. And we see that the Zionist ideology is actually collapsing. There are internal fights in Israel between, and it's not just philosophical, it's about what does it mean to be a Jew in Israel. Secular and democratic, and okay, it's democratic only for Jews, obviously not for the 20% Arab citizens, or theocratic. And this section is growing because the elite moved their money outside of Israel, and those who can get jobs left the country. Hundreds of thousands of Jews already left Israel. The electoral base shift, and those who are left fight with one another about what does it mean to be a Jew. But the thing is, one can't square a circle, right? Israel has never been democratic. But up to now, the Israeli society have not been able to imagine an alternative, and there are clearly other options. What are the alternatives? In one truly democratic state. At large, Palestinians don't want retribution. They want restitution. Because we're on the grounds of a church, my church, that Reformed church. I said at the beginning, why don't we take notice of the Palestinian Christians? I am personally deeply inspired and draw hope from their theology. They talk about the logic of love. It means that they fight a system, not people. And that they don't want to stigmatize someone else or say you are my enemy. Broader compassionate love is also there for the enemy. Doesn't mean that what people do aren't necessarily right. But they have the vision of a truly inclusive country. At the same time, they are very, very firm in saying we cannot serve God and the oppression of the Palestinians. We cannot. The two things don't go together. But we can. Palestinians and Israelis have a common future. We can organize our political life with all its complexity according to the logic of love and its power. First, we must end the occupation and establish justice. Where does hope come from? It's more than a choice. It's a way of looking at life. It's a way of saying adversity is not going to get the better of me. For the Palestinians, they call it sumut. It's about rootedness. They're rooted in the symbol of an olive tree that can grow for thousands of years. Many of those trees have been uprooted by Israel, but thousands of years. And still carry fruit, continue to grow through droughts, through wars, through hardship. For the Palestinians, the very presence of being alive, and yes, I suffer, but I still stand. Yes, I received basically a death sentence, still writing a poem. But speak of love and compassion. I take my hope from the Palestinians that it is possible. And all of us have lives, all of us have different things we take on in life. But when we look at the issues in our own country and in the world, let us connect the dots and try to understand that the Palestine and Israel, that context, has been a lens for so much that is wrong and can go right. That is a very important lens, and the dynamics there has to do with the economy, who funds our political parties, the kind of theology that we practice, the way we look at one another with our differences and our diversities. It's all connected. Some of us are full-out activists. Some of us sometimes say something around a dinner table. I want to appeal to churches to do the study, the discernment, and there are actually guides now on how to understand the second Congress document, not that it's not very easy to read and understand on itself. Allow ourselves to see and to hold what we see in ourselves and ask ourselves, who am I? What's the kind of life that I want? Just ask, what is the kind of life that I want? And then continue to live with joy and in gratitude for what we have, and keep space within oneself, take care of yourself, and stand up for someone or something else.